On the upper left, we have Hippocrates. Upper right is Charles Darwin, and we have the Facebook logo. So, what do all three of these have in common? For that, we have to look back into history. So before Facebook, Zuckerberg created Face Mash when he was a student at Harvard, and his intent was to put images of co-eds up on a website and figure out who was hot or not. This was a proof that we really do judge a book, or in this case, looks, by its cover. Going back even further into history, so we have Captain Fitzroy of the HMS Beagle, who almost did not let Charles Darwin aboard his ship because he too judged a book by its cover. In this case, and this is not made up, you can read about it in Charles Darwin's own biography. So Captain Fitzroy believed that Darwin's nose made him unsuitable because he didn't possess sufficient energy and determination for the voyage. Wow, strange but true. But this history of judging our faces goes back even further than that to the time of Hippocrates, about 3,000 years ago. So what do they all have in common? Physiognomy. That's the word that was invented by the Greeks to describe this notion of judging people by their looks. Hi, this is Jeff Goldfinger. Welcome to the 17th episode of the STEM Signal, where we help the STEM educated increase their career signal above the workplace noise. So here I am at our mountain retreat in the suburbs of Valencia, Spain. So I appreciate you putting up with any background noise of nature. So this is our third part in a series on trust. How can we be trusted in the workplace and how we can learn to trust others. The links to parts 1 and 2 are in the description below. But for now, let me give you a quick review.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
So summing up, the question I asked in part 1 is, can you be trusted? And how would you know? For that, I turned to Chilean philosopher, engineer, and business entrepreneur, Dr. Fernando Flores. And in his book, Conversations for Action and Collected Essays, he talks about 4 observable traits that you can use to determine whether somebody is trustworthy or not. For that, I developed the acronym Trust Your Ears. E for engagement, A for able, R for reliable, and S for sincere. So that was the summary of part 1. In part 2, I talked about the trustworthiness scale. And on the scale of trustworthiness, for those who are fully trusting of someone or something all the time, we call them naive. And for those who are untrusting of anything or anyone, they tend to be skeptics. Now, there are perfectly good reasons to be both naive and skeptic depending on your situation. So, for example, when I'm in the city of Valencia visiting Spain, it's a first world nation, I can naively trust that the tap water I drink will not harm me. That's not the case as I'm visiting an emerging country where I make sure I drink only bottled water or bottled soft drinks. Okay? All right, so in the workplace then, we want to be somewhere in between naive and skeptic, and for that I introduced the term prudent, where we are naive enough, we are trusting enough to enjoy the opportunities that come our way, and we're skeptical enough not to be taken for a ride. Okay, so parts 1 and 2 were linguistic interpretations. In part 3, today, I'm going to explore the biological and neuroscientific interpretation. And for that, I'm going to turn to Professor of Psychology at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, Dr. Alexander Todorov. Now, his book, Face Value, written back when he was a professor at Princeton University, where he did the bulk of his research, not only represents his own body of work, but also he summarizes the repetitive nature of this research. Dozens and dozens of researchers have proven what I'm about to share with you. So this is not just from one source, but I highlight him because this book is fantastic and he does a really good job of summarizing the state of affairs. All right, so what he and others have shown is that we judge people's faces in the blink of an eye. basically less than 200 milliseconds. It's really between 40 and 160 milliseconds. We are coming up with a judgment as to somebody's gender, their age, their ethnicity, their dominance, their competence, whether they're extroverted or introverted, and lastly, their trustworthiness. So here's an example from Todorov's book, and both the upper and the lower you'll see, and it doesn't need me to tell you, we see an increasing level of either trustworthy impressions or untrustworthy impressions. That came to you naturally. It's not something we had to learn. So if we're adults and we can do this, then the obvious question is, does it apply to children as well? And it turns out the researchers said yes. So there's something biological, there's something innate about our ability to determine trustworthiness just by looking at somebody's face. So then we ask, is this a human-only trait? Well, turns out it's not just a human bias. This happens to be true throughout the primate community. Our hominid ancestors learned how to recognize, in this case, we have a happy, joyful, trustworthy chimp on the left versus an angry, untrustworthy chimp on the right. And it doesn't take much, even as humans, to determine which of these chimps we'd prefer to approach. So then the question is, does it go beyond the hominid species? And it turns out, yes, it does.
Lions
And tigers and bears.
Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my!
So this is a survival instinct for just about any species. When they recognize a similar member of their species, but not a member of their local pack, they have to make a snap judgment as to whether or not that animal is trustworthy as they approach the pack. So it turns out that this truly is an innate thing that we have. But as most researchers have shown, these snap judgments sometimes prove to be incorrect over the long term. But in any case, Todorov talks about the association between happiness and being judged as trustworthy.
Don't worry, be happy.
And as he said in his book, so if you want to be seen as happy and hence trustworthy in your old age, smile more often now. As Parsons argued, the habits of the mind can find their way to the face, although it might take them considerable time to get there. So this notion of being happy is one of the quickest ways that we judge trustworthiness. Now, does that mean you should fake being happy? Not at all. I'll talk about that in a second as well. All right, so what are the key takeaways from today's lesson on biological trust? We evolved to judge each other by our looks, and it occurs in the blink of an eye. But this bias is only temporarily valid. It takes care of immediate survival needs, and sometimes it's often misjudged when evaluated over time. Lastly, our bias of trustworthiness tends to be towards familiar faces. Right? If we recognize somebody that we've seen, know from our past, and especially if they look like a blood relative, we tend to bias towards trusting them. And this notion of genuine versus disingenuous happiness, right? The ability to curl your mouth into a smile has to be matched with the ability of your eyebrows and the rest of your facial muscles to demonstrate genuine happiness, okay? So when I ask the question, can your colleagues be trusted and how would you know? The problem is you're working with both a biological bias, but the key is to trust your ears and the linguistic distinctions of engagement, ability, reliability, and sincerity. When you combine the two of them over time, you'll find yourself much more accurate when it comes to determine somebody's trustworthiness. All right, so that concludes part 3. In part 4, I'm going to talk about the hormonal basis for why we trust, in particular oxytocin. We're going to talk about that in the next lesson. I'm also going to include, in addition to links to parts 1 and 2, there's going to be a link to Todorov's talk at Emory University from a few years ago. It's a wonderful talk. He goes into more than just the trustworthiness aspect of his work, but it's worth a listen. As always, if you found this content valuable, please like and subscribe. But to truly increase your STEM signal, share this with others that you care about. And until next time, keep your STEM signal above the noise.
Let's get